It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ASUS PG32UQX. This video is part of a broader written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual, remember that what you see in the video depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and also by YouTube, and ultimately depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor would look like firsthand. This monitor features a 32-inch IPS type panel, an AU Optronics AHVA panel, more specifically, Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle, and this has a 3840 by 2160 resolution, and that's 4K UHD. It also features a 144Hz refresh rate and has a very fancy backlighting solution, and all of that will be explored in the review. Although I primarily use game examples or in-game examples and a little bit on the desktop, what I'm exploring here, especially in terms of the contrast and the colour reproduction, it applies more broadly as well. I just like to use games because they're nice dynamic environments and they're interesting to look at. They give some good examples, but you would observe the same kind of things if you're just browsing the internet, using the monitor for colour critical purposes, if you're just watching something on YouTube, on Netflix, that kind of thing. I do a lot of this myself as well, but I prefer to use in-game examples. I know this is actually a gaming monitor, so kind of it's quite fitting to use that, but even when I'm reviewing monitors that aren't gaming monitors, I like to use in-game scenes, but just be aware that what you see and what I'm talking about, it applies more broadly as well. So focusing first of all on the screen size and the resolution, this offers a really nice pixel density, a very strong pixel density. It gives what I like to call a distinct 4K look to things. It's not massively different in my experience to what a 27 or 28 inch 4K UHD model will provide. The pixel density isn't quite as tight, but it still gives you a significant edge in clarity compared to significantly lower resolutions, and that would include 27 inch 2560 by 1440, 1440p or WQHD models. It gives you an excellent amount of desktop real estate, really nice multitasking potential, so you can browse the internet and have other content open at the same time. Also, just something to note here, you will see from the video what looks like strange red cast in places, and it sort of might appear to shift in different points of the screen. That's because of the quantum dot backlight used for the monitor. My camera goes a little bit crazy, and I've tried various different settings and it's sort of a bit difficult to avoid this. So to the eye, you don't see that as strongly, so don't be put off by that. It's just because of the backlight used and the sensitivity of my camera to that. But anyway, you get a very nice amount of desktop real estate, lots of text on the screen. It's really nice crisp text. It has a very good crisp look to it. I'm not using any scaling at the moment, which is why I have such a large amount of desktop real estate at my disposal. If you do want to use scaling, you can do that. If you look at the 4K UHD experience section of the written review, there's some photos showing what things look like with 125% scaling versus 100% scaling, which is no scaling. And there's also a link to an article which looks at various other scaling settings, although that's written from the perspective of a 28-inch 4K UHD screen. But it's still relevant, and everyone will have their own preferences when it comes to scaling. For me, I'm very happy to use no scaling. I can actually use no scaling on a smaller screen than this as well, with the same resolution, but people will have their own preferences. And don't worry if you do need to use some scaling, because even with a bit of scaling, you still get a massive amount of desktop real estate. And if you use application-specific zoom or you're using scaling, you still benefit from the really high pixel density. So yes, everything looks larger, the text and other elements, but you still benefit from the pixel density for the text. It looks very crisp with really nice well-defined edges. And looking beyond text, suitably high resolution image content, 4K UHD movies, and certainly 4K UHD games. I'm going to show you a few of them as well. They definitely benefit from the resolution and the high pixel density. From the front, the monitor has a distinctive ROG aesthetic, quite a gamery look. Chunky stand design as well, that's powder coated metal, and it has a little central region which has a little core of what ASUS calls plasma copper, that's the colour. And that's made of plastic, just for a little bit of visual contrast. There's also a little NVIDIA G-Sync sticker. You can see that towards the bottom left there. You can take that off if you want, it is just a sticker. The bottom bezel includes a live dash display, and that's shown fully in the OSD video. I'll just show you it in action very shortly. There are also some lighting features, and that includes a down-firing logo. Although I'm not going to fully explore the features here, I thought it would at least be nice to show you them in action. So you can see the live dash feature there, the FPS counter. You also notice that it periodically wipes that little screen and then displays a ROG logo. It's doing that because it's an OLED screen and it has to avoid burn-in. You can see the projection onto the desk. You can customize the colors there as I show in the OSD video, and has a few different flashing patterns as well. At the rear of the screen, there is what they call light in motion, and you can turn that off if you prefer, or adjust the brightness in the OSD. And then there's another Aura Sync or Aura RGB feature, and you can customize that using software or in the OSD. Again, all shown in the OSD video. Aside from that, the bottom bezel, it's matte black plastic, moderately thick, as you can see, thicker in the middle to accommodate that live dash. And below that live dash OLED screen, there's also a little dial which controls the OSD, also shown in the aptly named OSD video. The screen has what I like to call a dual stage bezel design, so that includes slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a slender hard plastic outer component. So that panel border, it blends in very nicely when the screen's switched off, as it is now. The screen surface on this one is what I'd classify as light to very light matte anti-glare. So that means it doesn't give you quite as strong glare handling as some models. And if you've got bright direct light hitting the screen, I'm in quite a bright room at the moment, and from some angles you'll be able to see that direct light striking the screen surface. It gives a sort of what I describe as a glassy look. It's not quite the same as the sharp reflections of a glossy monitor, and it certainly isn't like that. And in general, you can see sort of my silhouette there, but it isn't a sharp reflection. So it still has effective glare handling. And it also has a positive impact on the image, the fact that it isn't a stronger matte anti-glare screen surface, and that's explored elsewhere in the review. From the side, you can see that the monitor is quite chunky, and that's because it does have a lot of important internal greatness, such as the FALD, full array local dimming backlight solution, and the G-Sync module. You can also see the stand itself. It is a chunky design, and you'll also be able to see a slight difference in the tone if you compare the top to the bottom. So the bottom's actually powder coated metal, and that has a bit of a darker grey appearance than the rest of the stand. And the rest of the stand, that's the stand neck, it's plastic rather than powder coated metal. In the vision review, there are various measurements given, including the depth of the stand. It is a bit of a desk depth hog, this one. It does give a robust and quite a premium feel to the screen overall though. Also get some ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit. You can swivel it left and right. And you can adjust the height. And the exact measurements for these adjustments given in the written review. At the rear now, you'll see it has quite an artistic looking design, mainly matte black plastic. Towards the top and the right has sort of an engraved texture. It's a smoother matte black plastic towards the bottom and the left. And there's a divider line between the two. That's kind of a shiny looking finish. Around the stand attachment points, there's also this shiny silver looking bit of plastic at the bottom, and at the top that's a sort of a glossy black plastic. There's also that logo that I showed you illuminated just before, so this is what it looks like when it's switched off. Sort of has a mirror-like finish really. So it seems like they've put quite a lot of thought into the rear of the monitor. It's a shame that for most people, this includes me, it's just facing the wall and you don't get to admire it anyway. You can remove the little shroud, the plastic elements around the stand attachment points. So you just remove them with, well, you can use a tool of your choice really. They might recommend a flathead screwdriver, or you could use a blunt knife, whatever you're comfortable with. You can just clip them off, and then you can unscrew the included stand, and that reveals 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. Another thing to be aware of, you might notice there's a little circle of ventilation slats at the top of the stand. And if you take a closer look, you'll see that there's the same around the attachment point in the middle. That's because this monitor does have an active cooling solution, and that's a small fan which will be on when the monitor's on, and it also stays on for a little bit after you turn the monitor off. Depends on the temperature of the screen, because it will remain quite warm, especially if you've been using it quite a lot or at high brightness, that kind of thing, for a little while after you've turned the monitor off. If you unplug it from the power, it will of course shut the fan down, so if you need it to be completely silent, if you want to go to sleep or whatever, then you can do that. But I just have a bit of a spool down time, that's by design. I didn't actually find this fan problematic. I didn't find it particularly loud. I could hear it when I was sitting using my system at idle, so I'm just on the desktop or something like that. But when my system was under load, the system fans from the GPU, etc., they were way louder than the fan, and I didn't find that the fan spooled up or anything and got louder when the screen was using HDR or had a very high brightness level or anything like that. Really, the volume was at, I'm not sure if it's exactly a constant level, I didn't measure it or anything like that scientifically, but it didn't ever spool up to be particularly audible. Certainly not over the noise of my system. I know that the fans can annoy people. I know it can be annoying even having an active cooling solution, but that's what they've gone for, and it is a requirement for the G-Sync module used and the complex backlight solution to have effective cooling, and this is how they've done it. So it's just kind of one of those things you have to put up with. And yes, I do appreciate it. It could be annoying. It'd be nicer if it wasn't there, or some alternative, some passive alternative could have been used. But it is what it is. I didn't find it annoying, so that's really all I can say about it. At the top of the screen, there's a little screw hole. I'm not sure of the exact technical term for this. There's actually a little cover here which covers a USB 2.0 port. So you can use that if you want. The idea is that you'd plug your camera into there and you mount it to the top of the screen, but you can use that port for other things if you want. There's also a light sensor there which is used for the ambient light functionality of the monitor, which is explored in the OSD video. But the port cover there just keeps it a bit neater. I think most people aren't going to be using this port, and they just want to keep that cover on. Just makes it a bit neater. Speaking of making things a bit neater, the ports are located at the bottom of the screen, facing downwards. They're actually beneath a removable port cover, but the port cover was, in my case, removed, not by me, but by another reviewer who used the monitor before me, and they seemed to forget to put it in the box or something like that, or maybe they wanted it as a little trophy to show that they've used the monitor, I don't know. But either way, I didn't get it, so I can't show you the port cover. This is what the ports look like when they're uncovered, and the cover just keeps things a little bit neater. But again, like I said before, I don't really see the back of my monitor, and I'm frequently changing cables around anyway, so for me, it works fine like this. So for the ports, there's a little rubber cover there that covers a service port that can be used by the service centre, by ASUS. There are two HDMI 2.0 ports. They support HDR, they support G-Sync, and they also support adaptive sync if you're using an Xbox Series X console. It's a bit of a strange one because it's not fully FreeSync certified for use with the PC, so if you've got an AMD GPU, it didn't want to communicate with it and let you use adaptive sync when you're using HDMI, and that's just because it's not fully certified in that way. You can use NVIDIA G-Sync though via HDMI. The other capabilities of HDMI include 3840 by 2160 at 120 Hz. If you do that, it does use a reduced chroma signal, a 420 signal. So really, the purpose of this actually works fine for SDR gaming, and it's designed so you can use the Xbox Series X and you can use a 4K 120 Hz signal. That's why they've specifically done this. As a PC user, you'll just be using DisplayPort. There's no reason not to on this model. Gives you more capability, and I'll talk about that very shortly. But if you are using the Xbox Series X, you can't have 120 Hz 4K and HDR. HDR is not going to work with a reduced chroma signal like this. Onto the remaining ports now. There's DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, so that is what you need to use for the full features of the monitor. That includes 144 Hz, 3840 by 2160, and you can run that at 10 bits or indeed 12 bits if you like. Just be aware that most content you consume, it's 8-bit content, and if you select automatic in the NVIDIA control panel, it's going to just give you an 8-bit signal anyway for SDR, and that's perfectly fine. If you're editing 10-bit content or indeed 12-bit content, or you specifically know that you're consuming content which is 10 bits or above, then that's when you'd want to select one of these alternatives. It's not going to do you any harm if you select it anyway. I know some people like to just select the highest number they can because bigger numbers are better, aren't they? Yes. Be aware that 12-bit is not supported on the monitor itself. It's actually using GPU dithering, but the monitor does support 10 bits monitor side. At 144 Hz, that's actually 8-bit plus FRC dithering. At 120 Hz and below, this is with the full 4K UHD resolution, by the way, the native resolution, that will be true 10-bit. The difference between these two, you're very unlikely to actually be able to notice any difference. The dithering is very finely handled, and if you're viewing most content, which is 8-bit, the dithering stage is essentially shut off anyway, so don't obsess about this. Under HDR, it's going to be using 10 bits for HDR10 content because that's appropriate. You could select 12-bit, but it isn't going to give you any advantage for this. You know, if you happen to be editing under HDR and you are using a 12-bit workflow for whatever reason, again, you can select that if you need to. And it's not going to do you any harm either way by just selecting that, even if you're not using that bit depth for your content. And you also get G-Sync support via DisplayPort, and you also get AMD FreeSync support. And just to round things off, there's a USB 3.1 upstream port, that's Type B port, the kind of square-looking one, and then there are two USB 3.1 downstream ports. There's also a 3.5mm headphone jack. And last but not least, although for most people it probably is least really, there is a K slot, Kensington lock slot. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor does have a very important setting. It's called variable backlight, and that controls the local dimming, and I will explore that shortly, but at the moment I've got that setting disabled. So the screen is just using its whole backlight as an individual unit. It's acting like most monitors would, in other words. I'm also running the game under SDR. So the first thing you'll notice, there is IPS glow. You can see this kind of haze towards the bottom corners of the screen. On this model, it's actually a bit more subdued than on some models. I don't like to call it a low glow panel. I don't really like to use that terminology. I think it could be a little bit misleading, but it is a bit lower than I'd usually see, especially on a screen of this kind of size, an IPS type model of this kind of size. But be aware that that IPS glow, the bloom of IPS glow, which does eat away at some detail and atmosphere, it can be brought out more strongly on units that have issues with backlight uniformity, black uniformity, issues such as backlight bleed and clouding. That can bring the IPS glow out more strongly. If you're using a high brightness setting, that will bring it out more strongly, and also if you're sitting closer to the screen. And that's why I refer to the screen size being important here, because if you set a given distance from the screen, I tend to sit around 70, perhaps 70 to 80 centimeters from a screen of this size. So the IPS glow can be brought out a little bit more than on smaller models just from a given viewing distance. So you just have to be aware of all of this. The other thing is that the static contrast, it's an IPS type panel, so that's not really its main strength. This one, it delivered a bit above 1100 to 1 for the static contrast under my test settings, with certain settings setting things so the colour channels were in more of a neutral position, more of their optimal position really. It was around 1300 to 1, so it's certainly stronger than some IPS type models in terms of its static contrast. So it has a little bit of an edge in that respect. But none of this really gives a deep atmospheric look to things, and as I show you with the variable dimming feature shortly, the variable backlight feature, that makes a massive difference in this respect. So if you do like that kind of look, you're certainly in luck, because there is a setting on this monitor that can really help in that respect, but I don't have it active at the moment. The brighter shades stand out nicely against the darker surroundings. Again, that's enhanced if you have the local dimming feature active, and certainly under HDR, which I'll also explore a bit later. These brighter shades have a little bit of graininess to them as well. The screen surface isn't as smooth as some, but it isn't as grainy as some either. It has what I'd describe as a slightly sandy appearance to these brighter shades. It's not a sort of heavy or smeary graininess, and the screen surface itself being light to very light matte anti-glare, it doesn't have any real layering in front of it, so it doesn't look like you're looking through a dirty window or the image is sort of distant beneath the outer layers of the screen surface or anything like that. In that respect, it's actually very good. Something that's worth noting on IPS type models like this, yes, there is that IPS glow, but the gamma consistency is very strong. So that means that the level of detail, although it is ebbed away because of the IPS glow, is actually quite consistent when you look sort of up and down the screen and a different section of the screen, comparing the centre to further out. Obviously on this scene it's a bit difficult to do that just on the video because I've got my flashlight on, which I can't turn off. But just as a general observation, on VA models you will have an area of black crush centrally where shades are too masked and the perceived gamma is too high, whereas further out the perceived gamma is lower, sometimes quite a bit lower than it should be, and that can reveal a bit of extra detail. TN models, they're pretty bad in terms of their vertical gamma performance, so you get significantly higher gamma than there should be higher up the screen, which can mask detail. Lower down the screen, things can look quite flooded. The perceived gamma is quite a bit lower than it should be. These kind of inconsistencies aren't here on IPS type models like this. You might also notice in the video a little spot towards the top of the screen. That's unfortunately a bit of pressure damage on my unit from a previous reviewer or someone who was handling the monitor before me. So I can only apologise about that if it becomes a little bit distracting. Perhaps you hadn't noticed it, and now I've mentioned it you probably will notice it, so double apologies from me. I'm now going to cover the variable backlight feature of the monitor. So this monitor has 1152 dimming zones, and if you use the variable backlight feature, that comes to life. You can use that in SDR and also under HDR. It's very much the default position under HDR, but under SDR you can also activate this setting. It has 3 different levels associated with it, level 1, level 2 and level 3. My preferred is level 2, and I'll come on to why very shortly. I've got it off just at the moment. I'm not entirely sure how well this will come across on the video, but to my eye, I can see that the black isn't particularly deep. It has more of a sort of greyish look really, and you can also see the IPS glow, although that's not extreme on this model. You'll hopefully be able to see a difference when I turn the feature on. So that's found in the image section of the OSD, and I'm just going to turn it on to level 2 for now. I immediately notice now that the black on this desktop background is much deeper. That's because the dimming zones there have dimmed significantly. You have to remember though, 1152 dimming zones, it is a good number, but compared to the approximately 8.3 million pixels of the screen, still a very small number, so it doesn't give you per pixel precision for the illumination. But it certainly makes the dark elements very dark, bright elements nice and bright. But there is a point in between those two where you get what's referred to as haloing or blooming. So the content is basically mixed on a given dimming zone, and the very dark elements are brighter than the surrounding purely dark dimming zones, so you can see that halo of light. It might not be clear in the video, and with how I've got it set up at the moment, this isn't extreme, certainly not in this scene, but it's just that around the whiskers, for example, things are a bit brighter, and there is a kind of fuzziness around the whiskers. That's just part of the image, but I'm talking about a little bit further out than that. There's a sort of slight bloom of light, and I do stress the slight in this case. There's also a little bit towards the bottom there, so you've got the bright elements from the search bar there, certainly much brighter than the background. You get the same around the desktop icons there as well. You can adjust the brightness with the variable dimming setting active. I like to set it up as I would normally. I mean, I set that up because it's a comfortable brightness level for me. It suits my room environment, and I found it's very much the same with local dimming active. Some people might like to increase that a bit, and I can certainly see why that could be appealing. You just have to be aware that if you do increase that, things could become uncomfortably bright, and also the halos become more pronounced. So they're more noticeable now. I am sitting in a dark room, and at this point, I wouldn't say they're extreme, but they're certainly more subdued using my preferred much lower brightness setting. So I'm just going to turn to that lower brightness setting for now and cover the different levels. So level 1, that's very gentle. And again, I'm not sure how this will come across on the video, but the blooming is now a lot more pronounced. And the reason for that is that it's trying to give you more gentle transitions between very dark and very bright content. And that means that it actually recruits a larger number of dimming zones to become sort of brighter than you'd ideally want, rather than there being abrupt changes between the bright and the dark. So that essentially just makes the halos bigger. They fill up a much larger portion of the screen. I'll see if I can adjust the camera a little bit to try and make this a bit more obvious. So they're not this obvious to the eye at all. You can see what the tiger looks like. It's completely blown out and overexposed. But I'm just trying to highlight the halo there, focus on how large that halo is. And this is just with my fairly low brightness setting, my fairly moderate brightness setting I should say. If I crank that up, you'll be able to see the halos more clearly on the video, but to my eye even here they're quite obvious. And if you go off angle, by the way, the halos become quite a bit more pronounced. And you can see that in the viewing angles video as well. You can see they become quite extreme there. Actually, I'm just going to keep it here for a bit, because this will be able to demonstrate the size of the halos for the different levels quite well. So I'll just switch it back to level 2. And level 1. In this scene, by the way, level 3, which is the most aggressive setting, that's very similar to level 2. So I'm on Twitter now on the lights out mode, so that has the dark background. Level 3, quite similar to level 2 again. For this particular scene. This will give a nice comparison with level 1 because it seems to show the halo effect more clearly on the video. So you can quite clearly see the blooming now, the halos. I would say it's exaggerated a bit on the video, but still to my eye you can see it in the same locations, and it certainly is more pronounced than with level 2 or 3. So again, I really don't see much point in using the level 1 setting. And don't worry, I won't spend too much longer on the desktop. I'm just really trying to show you how this works because it's important to understand how it works and also its limitations. But you can see here, again, level 2, the blooming's not extreme with my brightness setting at all, my preferred brightness setting. The darkness is really lovely, really deep. The bright elements stand out very nicely and I don't find it distracting at all. On the other hand, if you select dim, you'll see there's now this strange sort of inverted halo around the mouse cursor that follows you around. Quite strange. That's actually a lot more pronounced with level 3. This might not come across this way on the video, but to my eye it's a lot more pronounced with level 3. Level 1, to my eye, it's a lot less pronounced, but it is still there, and it's actually a lot larger, again, because it's recruiting more dimming zones, trying to be more gradual with the transitions, that kind of thing. The level doesn't actually change how responsive the zones are. They're always very responsive. You'll hopefully be able to see that from the video. So there aren't any issues with that, even when you're gaming or anything like that. Really, this just changes how reactive they are to brightness changes and how dynamic the experience can be. This sort of halo effect can affect a greater number of shades with level 3 than it can with level 2 or level 1. So level 1 at the moment with this purple shade in the background, no issue there. Level 2, no issue. Level 3 on the other hand, you can see this sort of inverted halo around the mouse cursor. And just a final issue to note. This one is really tricky to show on the video, I'm afraid, but the dimming zones for the bright content can be dragged down as well by the darker content. So with this white square here, it actually has a dimmer border there for the inner edge at the right and also the top. It actually has a slightly blue or cyan appearance to it as well. It's probably not going to be clear on the video, like I said, but it's certainly something I can see to my eye. But like these other issues, the things that I can see to my eye when I'm on the desktop, and for that reason I don't generally like to use this on the desktop, but if I'm watching video content, even if it's just part of the screen that's the video content and the other parts looking at something on the internet or that kind of thing, I will have this setting active whenever possible. And also when I'm gaming, I will have this active a lot of the time. Obviously for my specific testing, I generally have it disabled, but just for my own enjoyment, I really enjoy this setting, particularly at level 2. And the reason for that is that the video content and the games, they're far more dynamic and they have more intricate mixes of shades. And these issues that I showed you with the halos, the inverse halos, other issues, they just don't crop up in the same way. You just don't notice them. They don't strike you in the same way. But the advantages of using this in terms of the enhanced contrast is really easy to notice. At least I certainly find it is. So I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to show you some in-game examples before you fall asleep with this variable dimming setting. I've got it disabled at the moment. You'll be able to see that there's clear IPS glow. The dark elements just don't look deep, don't look atmospheric. The way that the camera's set up, I have to say, does slightly exaggerate the IPS glow and that kind of thing, but it will help show you the relative difference, and the relative difference to my eye or to your eye, especially if you're in a dim room as I am at the moment, is extremely clear in scenes like this. So I'm just going to activate it again with my preferred level 2 setting. you'll notice a significant difference now. So the detail remains, in fact the detail's better for those very dark elements. One thing I should make you aware of is that the gamma handling is slightly different on my unit when I've got this variable backlight setting active versus not active. So with my unit it actually followed the 2.2 curve very well without the local dimming setting active, but with the local dimming active it followed the sRGB curve, so that's actually the same as 2.2 for most shades, but for some of these very dark shades it actually lifts them up a little bit, the sRGB curve, to make them more detailed, and that completely makes sense to me to be doing that if you're using the local dimming setting. If this was the only change that was made, it would actually just make things look completely flooded, completely washed out, and it would just look quite artificial and weird. But because it's combined with the effective local dimming, and that really deepens those dark shades a lot, that really does help. So I can still see, again, it's not really going to be that clear on the video necessarily, but I can see some good subtle details with the bones in the background, the skulls in the background on the wall there, and that kind of thing. And just as a reminder, I'll just turn it off just so you remember what it looked like before. So needless to say, a massive and clear difference there. I'll just show you the different levels. So this is level 1. Level 2, a bit deeper. Level 3, for this scene, quite similar, actually a little bit deeper. But the issue I have with level 3 is much the same as it is on the desktop. Or to be more specific, there are some instances of that inverted halo trailing. I didn't actually notice that many, to be honest. In most scenes you can actually use level 3, and when you're in game or you're watching movies you're not really going to notice any issues, and that's fine. And if you like to use that setting then by all means do. But there just were some issues that cropped up with this inverted halo trailing in particular. And I noticed that on Battlefield 5, for example, when there was a foggy background and there were bright lights moving against it, I noticed that the lights had this sort of dim halo around them, and I found it a bit distracting. And it could appear as a sort of flickering effect as well. But with level 2, that wasn't there, or if it was in some places, it was very faint in comparison. So I didn't find it annoying at all with level 2. And to be honest, in most scenes I find level 2 perfectly adequate, works very well, and makes such a clear difference between having this technology disabled. So really you can consider level 2 the set and forget setting, but do feel free to try level 3 as well. But it isn't just for the dark shades or dark scenes where the variable backlight setting can really have an advantage. It's brighter scenes as well, so this daylight scene, well, it's kind of mixed, but it's essentially a daylight scene, and it does have, as many scenes do, some more shaded areas as well. I've got the setting disabled at the moment. With it enabled, again with my preferred setting, it kind of just looks like, well, with the dark scene, I describe it as looking like a veil of fog has been lifted, so the depth is just much better, and you can actually notice that here as well. I'll just flick it on and off a few times, so perhaps you'll be able to see it on the video, but to my eye it makes a very clear difference, even here. So if you focus particularly towards the corners of the screen, things just look a bit kind of hazy with it disabled, at least when you compare it to being enabled to a decent level like level 2. Level 3 slightly deepens things up a bit, and this is the kind of scene where level 3 can give you technically a bit of an advantage over level 2, but it's not massive. The difference between level 2 and off is much greater. And level 1's pretty gentle again. So it just gives a nice uplift really to some shades. It just deepens things up, keeps the bright shades nice and bright, and it just really lifts a bit of a haziness from the image. It's the best way I can describe it. So I really do appreciate this setting when I'm playing games, watching video content. So those issues that I showed you on the desktop, they really very rarely crop up when you're gaming, especially if you stick to level 2 and using a reasonable brightness level. I'm now on Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles there. So first up, the Lagom text. That appears a good blended grey throughout, as it should. There's a bit of a green tint to the striping of the text for the most part, a little bit of a red tint towards the bottom of the screen in places as well, but they're subtle tints that aren't obvious shifts between saturated red and green for the striping of the text, or flashes between orange, and that wouldn't occur if you move your head a bit either. So this is much stronger than you'd see on a VA or TN model, and it indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd hope for from a good IPS type model. The purple block appears a pinkish purple throughout the screen. It's pretty consistent, more consistent than it will appear on the video, no doubt. For some reason the video tends to give this strange sort of vignette appearance where it looks more purple at the edges, but you don't see that to the eye. It does appear just a little bit deeper towards the very edges of the screen, but that's subtle and certainly not as it appears on the camera, so good consistency there. The red block, that appears a good rich red throughout the screen. Again, a little bit darker at the very edges of the screen, the side edges in particular, but that's again quite subtle, and that is something which would be exaggerated if you're sitting closer to the monitor, less noticeable if you're sitting a bit further away. As I mentioned in the contrast section, I like to sit around 70 centimeters from the screen, perhaps 70 to 80 centimeters, and from that distance this really is very subtle. The overall consistency is excellent, much stronger than on TN or VA models, where you would see this appearing more of a burnt red in some sections, more of a vibrant saturated red in other sections, clear shifts even from just a normal viewing position when you're looking at different points of the screen. The green block appears a good saturated green chartreuse throughout, no complaints there. Perhaps a very small amount of brightening or extra yellowing towards the bottom of the screen, but again that's a subtle difference, not the kind of shift you'd see on TN or VA model, where you'd see a reddish shift between more saturated green and more of a yellowish green, depending on which section of the screen you're looking at. Royal blue appears a good deep royal blue throughout the screen. But this shade, even on TN or VA models, this particular shade is often shown very consistently anyway. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about updates to Steam. Typical. As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor using some in-game examples. So this monitor has a very wide actually, very generous colour gamut, has a quantum dot backlight for most content you consume, and that includes games like this under SDR. They're designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if the colour gamut of the monitor extends beyond that, you get extra saturation, a more vibrant look if you like. This monitor certainly delivers that if you're using the wide gamut setting. There is an sRGB setting which tones things down and makes things look more appropriate, more as the developers intend for SDR content like this, and I'll show you that as well and talk about that. But at the moment I'm using the full native gamut of the monitor, so I'm using its full colour capabilities in that respect, and things look very vibrant indeed. You do benefit again from that strong colour consistency, as I showed you with Lagom just before. So the richness of those shades is maintained very well throughout the screen. There aren't losses of saturation towards the edges or anything like that. And just in general, the colour gamut is very generous in some of the red region and also some of the green region. And I'll just flash that up on the screen just to show you, but this is fully explored in the written review in the colour reproduction section. So as you can see, it extends significantly beyond sRGB. I actually measured 97% of the DCI-P3 colour space, but even that is underselling the gamut in some regions, particularly in that green region. So there's an extension beyond that there as well. So what this means is that you'll see in this scene here, there are lots of reddy tones or reddish browns and oranges, and the red components are brought out too strongly. So on the brickwork there, the woody tones, they have a bit of a red cast, stronger than it should be, not as neutral as they should be. Patches of earth as well can look a bit too reddish. These tiles as well look rather striking, a bit too striking, not quite as subdued as they should look. And you get the same on the green end as well. There's some really nice lush greens, some nice deep greens as well, but some of the more muted shades and some of the yellowish greens, they tend to have the yellow components brought out too strongly, and they can look a tad neon actually in places because of the very generous colour gamut. But to be honest, this kind of look, it's something which some people really like. Some people will find this really inviting, really sort of exciting to look at, and they really like this look. And sometimes it might depend on the content you're actually viewing as to whether you like this look or not. It can also affect the skin tones incidentally, so they can look more saturated than intended. So sometimes some of the characters can look a touch sun-kissed, let's just say, a touch more sun-kissed than they should look, and that kind of thing. The markers there as well, really striking deep red. On some models where they extend more in the orange region but not so much in the pure reds, that kind of shade can actually appear too orange and a bit off for that reason. This one doesn't have that issue. And also be aware that it's very different to the look you'll get if you use a digital saturation boost, so you increase saturation in the monitor OSD, or if you use NVIDIA Digital Vibrance Control or something like that. So what that will do, that will pull shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So if you do that, you end up crushing your shade variety, and the most saturated shades don't become any more saturated. In contrast with the wide colour gamut, achieving the saturation as you get here, it maintains appropriate spacing on the gamut, so the variety is all there still. Oh, and also some of these blue shades, just to be a completionist, I will mention as well, the sky blues, they're really quite saturated as well. So if you want to tone things down, you want this sort of SDR content to look more as the developers intend, or if you're just browsing the internet and you want to make sure things look more appropriate with the sRGB colour gamut in mind, which is really the sort of standard or lower common denominator, if you like, which most people have in mind when they're creating content, or should do. Then there is a setting which this monitor is actually set to by default. So it's an image, display SDR input. Simply set that to sRGB rather than wide gamut. And that instantly tones everything down, so things look more appropriate now, things look more neutral. And the really nice thing about this as well is that you regain full flexibility. It doesn't replace any other settings, it doesn't lock off your brightness, it doesn't even lock off your colour channels or your gamma control or anything like that. So this is absolutely how an sRGB emulation setting should be implemented, so you get full control over everything. The monitor, or at least my sample, was actually very well tuned out of the box in many respects in terms of its gamma. The colour balance wasn't quite where I wanted it, but it wasn't too bad really. And this setting does cut down on the gamut very effectively. And I'll just flash that up on the screen just so you can have a little bit of a comparison in your mind. But again, look at the colour reproduction section of the written review for full exploration of this. So if you compare that to the native gamut that I showed you earlier, big difference there. There's actually a little bit of sRGB undercoverage, although there was on my unit. I recorded 97% sRGB. Some units will be closer to 100%. Mine just had a little bit of undercoverage. It doesn't really make a massive difference to the output. It is very faithful overall to the sRGB colour space. And that's explored in a little bit more detail in the Spider Checker 24 section of the written review. If you look at that, there are some nice visual examples of this setting, and that's compared to the native gamut as well, and compared to various reference shades. So definitely check that out if you're interested in that kind of thing. So if you think more about the gamut capability in general, which really defines the limits of saturation and the workspaces you might want to use on this monitor if you're into colour critical work or editing your own content. sRGB, obviously that's a good one. DCI-P3, I recorded 97% DCI-P3, so it's good for work within that colour space as well. And I didn't really talk about Adobe RGB, although I do discuss that in the written review, but I measured 100% Adobe RGB, and there's also some extension beyond that, particularly for some red shades. So it doesn't have an Adobe RGB emulation mode or anything like that, or any setting of that sort. That's not really what this monitor is designed for. But if you do want to use the Adobe RGB colour space and you own your own colorimeter or similar device, then you can have the gamut mapped properly for Adobe RGB. You should get full Adobe RGB coverage without that extension beyond, because that will be corrected with your profiling. And you can use that for accurate reproduction within the Adobe RGB colour space as well. I'll just switch back to the wide gamut setting just to give you a little bit of a visual comparison. Again, just be aware that you can't see the exact nature of the differences on the video, and I doubt your monitor has a colour gamut that's as wide as this one, and the video itself isn't really designed with this gamut in mind either. So again, it's not a proper representation, but it will certainly show you that there's a lot of extra saturation with the native gamut. But the flexibility this offers in terms of creative purposes is really good, and the sRGB emulation setting, very well implemented, very flexible, really hits the spot if you like things to look more as developers intend, for SDR, or if you prefer things to look highly vibrant, just use the wide gamut setting. Certainly have that option as well. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider now, and I'm running the game in HDR. This monitor is VESA DisplayHDR 1400 certified. That is the highest level of certification which VESA will currently certify for. So one thing this does is it puts that local dimming solution, which I showed you under SDR, to excellent use. It becomes a lot more dynamic. For example, at the higher end, it can reach very high luminance levels. I actually measured a peak luminance of 1700, a bit above 1700 candles per meter squared, which is incredibly bright. And I also measured a sustained luminance, so that means if the entire screen was displaying white for an extended period of time, I measured above 1200 candles per meter squared. You can see the exact measurements under various conditions in the contrast and brightness table in the written review. But really what you need to know about this is very impressive in terms of how much brightness it can output. And because it has 1152 dimming zones, it isn't just flooding the entire screen with that brightness at all. It's actually showing really nice deep dark shades at the same time as those very nice bright shades. So this scene here, even this scene here, it's really quite mixed in terms of its brightness, but it does have some really nice dark elements. And usually when I enable HDR on a monitor, it will either use pretty ineffective local dimming, or it will use no local dimming at all, and it will just stick to a fairly high luminance level. This monitor is perfectly capable of doing that. If you are a glutton for punishment and you want to disable the local dimming feature, that's what this will do. Turn off the variable backlight. You'll see things look horrendous now. The depth has completely gone. The entire screen is now just bright, but it's the same brightness throughout the screen. The backlight brightness is just controlled as one unit. And it also limits your peak luminance here. I think it was to around 600. I can't remember exactly, but it was a lot lower than it was with the variable dimming setting active. So I see very little reason not to use this. If you've got this monitor, you're using it under HDR, and you haven't got the variable backlight feature active, you're doing something wrong. And again, the differences between level 2 and level 3 are quite slight for the most part. Feel free to use level 3, but for the same reasons I gave earlier, I prefer level 2 because there are some issues with level 3 in some scenes. Another advantage of HDR, which really sort of builds on the capabilities of the backlight, is that it supports 10-bit color reproduction. This monitor actually technically supports 12-bit, or the monitor itself will support a 10-bit signal, but you can use additional dithering on the GPU to create a 12-bit signal. This is HDR10 that this monitor is responding to, and the reason it's called HDR10, or the primary reason, is actually because it uses 10 bits per subpixel. So there's no reason to set the monitor to 12-bit or set your system to 12-bit. It's not going to give you any advantage, but it's also not going to harm you in any way if you do that, or as far as I'm aware it shouldn't. In my testing it didn't, so don't worry too much about this. Most users actually should just keep the setting in NVIDIA control panel set to automatic, then it will automatically use a 10-bit signal as appropriate for HDR10, and 8-bit signal for SDR, which most content is in SDR. If you're developing content yourself, you're creating content, and you know which bit depth you want to work in, and that's very specific, then by all means manually select something else. Anyway, what this 10-bit color reproduction does, it enhances the nuanced shade variety. So there's a really nice variety of subtly different, very dark shades. It's not just the very dark shades it affects, it's also the very bright shades, or the bright shades, which I'll come on to shortly. It also allows it to put its very generous color gamut to good use, which I'll also explore shortly. But for this scene here, it's primarily the nuanced variety of dark shades which really helps. Again though, there aren't millions of dimming zones, 1152, so it's enough to really help the bright element there stand out really nicely. The darker elements have really good depth, and something which is a lot more impressive on this model actually compared to any other I've used under HDR, and that would include the PG32UQX, which has 384 dimming zones. The precision is certainly better on this PG32UQX because of the larger number of dimming zones. So you can see here, they're fairly close together, the very dark elements and very bright elements, but it doesn't flood those dark elements, as you might see here if you had significantly fewer dimming zones. Another thing I should mention is that often on the camera you'll be able to see, for example here, it's compensating for that brightness, and it's not showing that darkness as it appears to the eye. I can still see that nuanced shade variety. That really does help bring out amazing detail to these dark elements as well. It's really still detailed. I can see all of the little crevices on the rocks. I can see various different textures there. So it doesn't look as it appears in the video to the eye, and this really is something that you have to see by eye to appreciate, but it is very impressive. You will see halos, and because it's HDR, these halos can be much brighter. So the crosshair there, it's not pumping out its full luminance here for that crosshair, but it is certainly lifting the dimming zones above the surrounding dark shades, so you can see a halo there. You'll be able to see this on the video quite readily. I have to say though that for most content you just don't notice this. It just isn't something which really distracts you. Another thing worth mentioning is I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment. It's connected with DisplayPort, but I have connected this monitor up using HDMI and it gave a very similar experience. I also tested with an AMD Radeon RX 580 and it gave a very similar experience. So what I'm highlighting here with this game, it applies if you're using other connections and other systems as well. So if you're using an HDR compatible games console, you can expect a very similar experience to what I'm describing here. The strengths and weaknesses will be exactly the same. I also have observed a wide variety of content on Netflix, a wide variety of HDR content, and again, for the same reasons as I'm highlighting here, I was really impressed with the overall HDR experience. I actually rewatched a lot of content on Netflix because I really enjoyed the HDR so much, and it really just gave an extra dynamic to things which is just missing under SDR. And I actually ended up replaying the whole of Battlefield 5 as well because I was enjoying the HDR so much on this one. So this scene here, it really separates the good versus the not so good HDR performers. This one is very firmly in the good camp. The glint on the water surface there, you'll see from the camera it just appears as a giant ball of light. It's not like that to the eye, but it's very bright, very eye-catching indeed. It's pumping out quite extreme luminance levels here. The same for the brightness up there, but because it's localized, because of the local dimming, the entire screen isn't like that. And strangely enough, I actually find this more comfortable to the eyes. I don't find it painful at all. But in terms of how fatigued my eyes feel using HDR with this one, I actually find it more comfortable than using models which will just have the entire backlight at a moderate brightness, let's say 400 to 600 candles per meter squared, or have, you know, very ineffective local dimming. The FALD solution on this one really does help because you're only having small sections of the screen, or relatively small section of the screen in most scenes, showing this very high brightness, and it's not something that you're constantly exposed to. Another thing I really like about this one is that even in a brighter room, I've just brightened the room up, this is actually how I'll mainly use this monitor, and I'll include SDR and HDR. I don't tend to sit in a man cave when I'm using this monitor, but I can still appreciate those bright elements. They stand out beautifully well. The dark elements, again, have excellent depth. So it's just a very enjoyable HDR experience overall. The nuanced shade variety from the 10-bit color reproduction helps as well. I'm just going to adjust the camera so that this doesn't just look like a giant ball of light. You're not going to be able to appreciate this on the video because it's not an HDR video. Your monitor's capabilities, I have no idea what they're like. But to the eye, there are some beautifully smooth gradients here. This really helps with weather effects, light effects, that kind of thing. And it gives things a very natural look, especially when combined with the effective local dimming. The other advantage of HDR is color reproduction. So this model has a very generous colour gamut. I measured 97% of the DCI-P3 colour space for the colour gamut, and it actually extends quite a bit beyond DCI-P3 in some regions, particularly some green regions of the gamut. So it actually closes in a bit more on Rec 2020 in some regions. So under HDR, unlike SDR, it isn't the sRGB colour gamut that's being targeted by the developers. They have the DCI-P3 colour space in mind as a near-term target and Rec 2020 as a longer-term ambition, if you like. So a nice generous colour gamut like this is put to use very well under HDR. Shades which are supposed to look natural, which are supposed to look pastel, which are supposed to look more muted, they do. Lara's skin, for example, it looks a bit sunburnt or suntan, not really sunburnt, a bit overly tanned, let's say, under SDR. Her hair as well has too much of a red quality. Even the little reddish browns on the bow here, little elements there, they're brought out too strongly I explored these kind of things in the color reproduction section earlier. Under HDR, it's all, because the gamut's mapped appropriately, you don't get that extra saturation, you don't get those hues brought out too strongly. Same with the greens here as well. You don't have things looking neon where they shouldn't, or yellow components brought out too strongly. But things appear very lush, very deep where they should. So there's some really lovely lush looking green shades here which are well beyond the sRGB colour gamut, and some of them are very likely beyond DCI-P3 as well, but they don't look out of place because they're supposed to look like that. I'm now on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This was one I showed you with just variable dimming active under SDR earlier, and under HDR this has a really lifelike look which is far beyond what it had under SDR. So the daylight is really captured in a lovely way. It has a very natural brightness to it, very natural look to it. The glints of light on those houses in the background as well, really lovely, stands out very nicely. And these aren't extreme brightness levels. It doesn't, again, it's not like it's fatiguing the eyes because it's stupidly bright or anything like that. There's localized brightness. Again, I'm just going to adjust the camera to try and show you this a bit better. Yeah, adjusting it the right way would help. So you can see the clouds there, for example. They have very localized patches which have the highest luminance where they should have sort of a natural glow to them. The rest of it has reasonably high luminance, and then there's just a huge array of different luminance levels, and this is really how HDR should be. Most monitors don't do this at all. They will just flood this scene under HDR. So that looks really nice and natural. The depth of these dark shades is really nice indeed. And again, I don't sit here and spot issues with halos and that kind of thing. This is really quite typical of the kind of scene you'll experience most of the time under HDR. And again, I'm not saying things are absolutely perfect. If you had a greater number of dimming zones, for example, technically these tiny little details, like the cracks in the rock there, for example, they could be even darker than they appear. So that could help the definition even more. But with the nuanced shade variety, with the enhanced nuanced shade variety of the 10-bit colour reproduction, plus a good degree of local dimming, so the backlight's pretty dim there, as it should be, that does help. But again, you can see a halo around my crosshair, because it's white. You can see it lightens up the very dark shades there. That little glow down there, by the way, that's just a little item I can pick up. It isn't a halo. But I can't really do this any justice, to be honest, or there's not a lot more I can say about it. It's just that to the eye, it really is a beautifully dynamic experience. The fire there as well has a lovely glow to it, a really nice natural look to it. The rest of this hut, good depth, great variety of shades as well, really nice natural look to it. And again, the colour reproduction really stands out here. So the blues of Lara's dress, the oranges of these dress, there's some really nice vibrant shades, the greens here in the background as well, lush, great variety. Really does hit the spot for me in terms of colour reproduction as well, HDR on this monitor. The blue flowers as well, they stand out really nicely, a lot better than they do on some monitors under HDR. And it isn't just the colour gamut, although the colour gamut really is helping a lot here. It's also, again, the luminance being appropriate for these different elements. It really helps inject extra depth or keep things looking deep and saturated as they should look. These berries or the fruit here as well, really rich orange shades there, well beyond sRGB. But at the same time, you get a nice variety of natural looking greens, earthy browns, muted pastel shades, appropriate skin tones, all of that kind of thing. I'm now on another one of the scenes which I showed you under SDR with the local dimming solution active, the variable backlight solution active, and you can see a giant halo in the middle of the screen. That's because Lara has a torch on at the moment. Now the dark shades here look brilliantly dark now, really atmospheric, and at the moment I'm sitting in a completely dark room, but this is something I can appreciate even in a better lit room. I'm not going to bother changing my lighting conditions because on the video you'll just see lots of glare on the screen and you won't be able to see any detail at all. But to my eye, I can always appreciate the extra black depth. And the reason that this looks quite different under HDR versus SDR with local dimming is because under HDR the monitor is responding to HDR metadata. So it's basically aware that the very dark shades here, although it's not pure black, there's actually a mixture of very dark and somewhat lighter shades mixed in because there are actually some skulls there. You won't be able to see the details as I've got the camera set up at the moment. I'll try and adjust that to see if I can... okay, so basically the details are so subtle that you can't really pick them up on the camera, regardless of how I set things up. But to the eye, you can see these subtle details. And again, the 10-bit color processing is really helping with this. So the luminance levels of the backlight super dark. HDR metadata is saying, look, this should look deep, it should look atmospheric. I know that this isn't pure black, but let's set the brightness to really low levels because that's how this is supposed to look. And that's exactly what it does. But because it has effective local dimming, the brighter elements in the middle, nice and bright there, stand out really nicely. And you might have noticed when Lara turned around, she only does it briefly, I'm afraid, but the torch on her chest there, and in fact around her bow, yes, there is a halo. You'll be able to see that quite clearly on the video, and actually it looks exaggerated on the video. It looks like a really obvious and abrupt sort of end to the halo. To the eye, it's more gradual, so it actually looks a bit more natural than that. But it is still there, and again, that's because there aren't millions of dimming zones, 1152 dimming zones, and you can also see it around the HUD elements there. These are the kind of times when you will see haloing, and with the quite extreme luminance levels that it's pumping out for the brighter shades here, and the very, very deep dark shades surrounding it up there, for example, you will see this haloing. You can't escape it, I'm afraid, but it is exaggerated on the video at the moment. To my eye, it isn't this extreme at all. But I do want to point out that it is there. I don't want to pretend that this monitor doesn't have haloing. It does. It's just one of the things which, when I'm playing games like this, when I'm playing a variety of games, when I'm watching movie content, I do notice it in places as well, but it just doesn't bother me because the overall HDR experience is just really on a different level on this monitor compared to, what you'd usually experience. And I've lightened the room up, and I'm afraid you're just going to see lots of glare on the screen, or a fair bit of glare. To the eye, it's not noticed in the same way, but I can certainly still notice and appreciate the depth of those dark shades. Really, it just blends in quite seamlessly with the panel border. It really is that deep. Whereas the bright shades stand out really nicely still. And yes, you can still see the halos even in quite a brightly lit room. It does take a bit of an edge off those halos, I suppose, but regardless of the lighting conditions, again, they're not something I really focus on when I'm playing games like this. And if you're in maps or have other areas of individual shade, this is when you can start to notice slight areas of inverse haloing in places. These inverse halos are generally not there at all actually with level 2, which is one of the reasons I prefer to use them. But again, as I observed under SDR with the local dimming feature active with level 3, there were some instances where this would crop up. So I did prefer the balance of level 2 overall, but I have to say, don't be afraid to use level 3 if you own this monitor. It does work very well in most cases, and really they're few and far between these scenes where issues will crop up. But I still think that level 2 is very nicely balanced, and really it's still a very dynamic setting, and it really works very nicely indeed under HDR. And just a final thing to note, I should have really mentioned this earlier on, but I totally forgot as I was completely entranced by the HDR experience. You can adjust some settings under HDR which you wouldn't normally be able to adjust under HDR, whereas others are locked off as usual, so you don't get the full flexibility. So in the menu here, you can see that Game Visual is greyed out. Everything else can be changed here, including OD, Overdrive, Game Plus and Dark Boost. Dark Boost is going to upset the image. Really wouldn't advise touching that, but if you need to, for whatever reason, you can do so, even under HDR. Image, most notably peak white nits, 1400, greyed out. You can't change the brightness, in other words. That's the spec for VESA DisplayHDR 1400. As I noted, my unit actually exceeded that. I measured above 1700, but that's the spec, and either way you can't adjust the brightness manually. You can adjust contrast, variable backlight as well. As I mentioned, of course, you could disable that if you are a complete weirdo. That's so much better. And you've got your aspect control setting if you need to use that. Blue light filters grayed out. Display SDR inputs not relevant for HDR, so that's grayed out. And the other notable thing is that color temp can be accessed. You can't access other things, you're just going to be upsetting HDR image too much by doing that anyway, so you don't want to be doing that, but you can adjust the color temperature, that's fine if you need to. You can even have this combined with the low blue light setting essentially, if you set this to 4000K. But be aware that although it's low blue light, it's relatively low compared to other color temperature settings. But because it's HDR, you're going to be having lots of light in general pumped out at you in some scenes. So you shouldn't really consider this low blue light, just lower blue light than you'd otherwise have under HDR. Or you can even set this to user mode and manually configure the red, green and blue color channels. I'm back on good old Battlefield 5, soon to be Battlefield 2042. Not with this model, I'm afraid. Be for future reviews because it isn't out yet. But either way, this title has a good range of different pixel transitions it shows you, various different movement speeds, that kind of thing. So it's a good test for responsiveness on monitors. And this one, it has a 144Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running at a good solid 144 frames a second. You can see that towards the top right of the monitor, or you might be able to see that. It's very small on this monitor because of the high pixel density, but there's a little green 144 just in the top right. There might be a few very slight dips below that very briefly, but really I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of the responsiveness. So that 144Hz refresh rate and the suitably high frame rate as well, this combination means that the monitor is outputting 2.4 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz, 60 frames a second. This gives you two main advantages. One is that it enhances the connected feel. That describes the precision and the fluidity as you interact with the game world. Another important part of connected feel, really does complete the experience there, would be to have a low input lag, and the input lag on this monitor certainly was low. I measured a bit above 2.5 milliseconds on this one, just a little bit above, and that includes not just the signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel, and that's what most people think about when they think of input lag and what most people are concerned about, so that's very low indeed. It also includes the pixel response element of input lag, which really accounts for pretty much all of that figure I just gave you in this case. If you've got the variable backlight setting active, then that does increase the signal delay, and I measured between 12 and 13 milliseconds with that. So that isn't an extreme value even then, especially not for the kind of gaming which this monitor is really designed for. It's really designed for an immersive gaming experience. This isn't really designed for strong competitive gameplay, and there are some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness which I'm going to talk about and try and demonstrate here, which would mean that it isn't really perfect for competitive play. And the other element of that high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is also important, and that is the decrease in perceived blur due to eye movement. That occurs regardless of what the pixel responses are doing, but pixel responses are still an important part of perceived blur, and there's a bit of a discussion about perceived blur in the written review if you're not familiar with this term. There's also an article all about responsiveness which covers this, so check that out if you're not familiar. Check out the written review, the responsiveness section there. It's well worth a quick read if you're not familiar with the term perceived blur. It is an important one when it comes to understanding monitors in terms of its response behaviour. But coming back to those pixel responses, yes, that's still an important part of perceived blur. And for this scene here, it's mainly composed of medium to brighter shades, but there are some dark shades mixed in. And actually for most of these medium shades, the monitor does pretty well in terms of its pixel responses. There aren't really any significant weaknesses for most of these transitions, but if you look at the brickwork here, for example, it's actually composed of some dark elements as well, and the transitions involving these darker shades, this monitor does struggle a little bit with them. You get the same with the foliage there, so it does mean that during motion there is just a little bit less detail than there could be. But for the particular scene here, there isn't anything which really stands out in the way of obvious conventional trailing. There is a bit of overshoot. You can see that around the flag post and around the wall there to the left as well. So there's a little bit of overshoot in places, but it's not super bright, it's not extreme overshoot, probably not even going to be visible on the video because it's not really particularly strong overshoot. If you are super sensitive to overshoot and you don't want any overshoot, there is an option to get rid of it completely. So you simply set the OD, overdrive, to off. That does get rid of the overshoot, but it significantly weakens the pixel responses overall. There's now an obvious fuzziness, basically a huge increase in perceived blur, and things really look quite messy. It looks like someone's applied some strange filter on the game to increase motion blur significantly. There's some really rather pronounced weaknesses, so I don't think anyone would really want to use this setting. There's also an extreme setting for people who like to punish themselves. And if you don't know what overshoot is, or you don't know what overshoot looks like, this is it. Obvious bright trailing all over the place. And sometimes I say this and it's so obvious to the eye, but it doesn't come across in the video, which can be quite annoying. But I can definitely see it to my eye all over the place. Really good example to the left of the wall there. And again, I say a really good example. Typically when I say that, it doesn't come across at all on the video. And around the flag there as well. Hopefully some of these will at least be visible on the video. You just have to take my word for it. This setting is not attractive, very ugly, loads of overshoot all over the place. So back to my preferred normal setting now. The two sort of areas really where this monitor struggles when it comes to pixel responses, very dark shades and also very bright shades. So white is a good example of that. They don't have to necessarily be very bright shades. They could be strongly saturated primaries as well. Say strong red shades, strong blues or strong greens, for example, or they can be a little bit off from that. But basically strongly saturated or very bright shades. There are some more distinct weaknesses, and they're particularly noticeable if the background is kind of dark. So the text here, for example, it has what I would describe as a heavy powdery trail. And that means that it does extend quite a bit beyond the object, but it isn't really what I'd classify as a smeary trail here. And that's the kind of trailing you would typically associate with VA models. And I'll just look at another scene to give some more specific examples of these weaknesses. So here there are plenty of high contrast transitions being performed. There are some very bright shades and some much darker shades all mixed in together. And this doesn't give the kind of look which you typically get on a high refresh rate VA model. So the boats down here, for example, the canoes, usually if you move the mouse like this, you would see a clear smoke-like appearance, smeary trailing all over the place. On this one you don't get that. There are still some weaknesses there though. There's again that heavy powdery trailings, and there's just a general mask of perceived blur where these darker shades mix in. Things just don't really look as clear during motion as they could or should at 144 Hz, 144 frames a second. But VA models again, usually more defined weaknesses. With the flag here as well, some of that heavy powdery trailing for the dark red, but it's not smeary in appearance like you get on a VA model. It's a bit of overshoot mixed in as well around the flag post, perhaps just a little bit of overshoot. It's not really going to come across on the video, I'd imagine. It's not strong overshoot. The lantern here, that shows really some of the weakest transitions that will be performed on this model. And again, some people might describe this as smeary trailing here actually. I wouldn't say it is because it doesn't extend in the way that VA models do. The pixel response weaknesses here, this is really where they're sort of creeping between maybe 10 and 20 milliseconds. They're certainly a lot weaker than they should be for 144 Hz, 144 frames a second. But on VA models, the kind of weaknesses could extend to perhaps 40 milliseconds, sometimes a bit beyond, and they're just more widespread. And they just give you this sort of smeary trail which extends quite far back from the object. With this one, it doesn't extend that far back from the object. It still stays reasonably close, but of course, ideally it wouldn't be there. Around the light here, there's a little bit of overshoot. It's actually what I call shadowy trailing, so it's a bit darker than the background colour. But that's not strong overshoot. Probably isn't going to come across on the video. For the makeshift roof there, with VA models, I'd quite frequently see more obvious weaknesses than I do here. Again, not perfect transition here. There are some weaknesses there. I think some of the more pronounced weaknesses can be found again with these very bright shades against the medium to dark background, that blob there. I'd almost call this smeary actually. This does extend quite far out, but I think I'll stick with heavy powdery trailing, just my very broad classification system I like to use. And not in this particular scene, but it is worth noting that sometimes you can see very thin white objects, let's say strip lighting, with a slight colour to it, so a slight cool tint, let's say. Then you can get some leaching out of sort of blues or cyans or different colours contained in the tint. They can kind of leach out as well because of these weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. I talk a little bit about that in the written review. I don't have any good examples which I could capture on the camera, I'm afraid. It's a little bit tricky to show you, but it is just part of this weakness for these very bright shades. But overall, I have to say that these sort of weaknesses, it distances itself from your typical high refresh rate VA models. I'm not talking about the Samsung Odyssey G7 models here, the 240Hz WQHD ones, because they are quite special in this respect, but they're very unlike any other VA model, literally any other VA model out there at the moment in terms of their response behavior. Most VA models are just a lot weaker than what you're seeing here with this PG32UQX. But there are certainly stronger IPS type performers out there at the moment. If you do fancy a bit of competitive gaming, then perhaps consider this, but even so, sensitivity to this kind of thing varies. Some people are going to be absolutely fine with this, and really for the more casual end of the gaming spectrum, perhaps a little bit of slightly competitive gaming mixed in, then I'd say this is probably going to be fine, but again, it's very subjective. I've now turned on the frame rate or FPS counter feature of the monitor. You can see that in the top left. This monitor features G-Sync, variable refresh rate technology. It has a G-Sync module. That just accesses the module. You get the full functionality of the module. You get all of the benefits that I'm talking about here, or I'm going to talk about here. But I'm actually using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, so I'm accessing the G-Sync module the more conventional way. But really the implementation was very similar on my AMD GPU as well. So if you are an AMD user, I know this very much is sort of an NVIDIA flavoured monitor if you think about it, and G-Sync in general, but the support for FreeSync and how you can access the G-Sync module, you know, don't dismiss it just because you've got an AMD graphics card. It can actually work very well there as well. It ensures where possible that the refresh rate of the monitor matches the frame rate of the content. That gets rid of tearing and stuttering. So if you're not using VRR, you don't have VRR active, or you don't have access to that on a monitor, you'd have to use VSync if you wanted to get rid of tearing, and you'd then get stuttering with these frame rate and refresh rate mismatches, or you disable VSync and you'd suffer from tearing. But with G-Sync, you don't get either issue from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. So that could be very nice if you're sensitive to tearing and stuttering like I am. Very pleasant thing to have this indeed. I've bumped up my graphics settings just so I can get that frame rate down. You'll see it's around 90 frames a second at the moment. G-Sync's still doing its thing. There's no tearing or stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. And a nice thing about the G-Sync module is that it has variable overdrive, so it retunes the overdrive over a broad range of refresh rates, so it doesn't have the issue that you typically get with adaptive sync models where the overshoot becomes stronger as your refresh rate dips, which it will do with variable refresh rate as your frame rate dips. So it's nice not having that. Variable overdrive gets rid of those kind of things. There is still some overshoot, but there was at higher refresh rates as well. It's not really, perhaps it's a bit stronger to be honest, but it isn't really strengthened in the same way that it would usually be on most adaptive sync models. The other thing to be aware of is that this frame rate, it's still a lower frame rate. It's significantly lower than 144 frames a second or so. So you do get that drop off in connected feel. The precision isn't the same when you're interacting with the game world. The connectedness just isn't there in the same way. It's not bad though, only 90 frames a second is still a decent frame rate, especially at the 4K resolution to be honest, but so I'm not going to be too fussy about that. I'm just saying that compared to 144 there is a difference, and there's also an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. The weaknesses in terms of the pixel response times and the sort of powdery trailing I was talking about, or the heavy powdery trailing, they're still there even here. They're a bit reduced actually, they're not as obvious as they were at 144 Hz. I'm not trying to say they were super obvious, and again it's very subjective, but to me, as someone who's tested a lot of monitors and I'm very sensitive to this kind of thing, I can certainly still notice these issues, but the edge is taken off that compared to at much higher frame rates. I've bumped up the graphics settings again, and I'm now hovering around 60 frames a second or thereabouts. Now again, that connected feel has further been ebbed away, the perceived blur is further increased due to eye movement. The weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, yeah, they're still there in places, but not as pronounced as they are again at the much higher frame rates. And certainly for those brighter shades, the weaknesses are sort of so pronounced there, but that they do certainly still stand out even here as weaknesses. But in general, it's really the perceived blur due to eye movement now, which is the main driver, and the overshoot is, again, quite tolerable. It is there in places, but certainly not as strong as it would be if there wasn't variable overdrive. And yes, if you want to get rid of it, you could turn the OD off, and I'll just do that quickly. If you want to get rid of it completely, that is. But now, even though the pixel response requirements for a good performance are greatly reduced because I'm only at 60 frames a second or thereabouts, the weaknesses are really quite pronounced even so. The pixel responses are just really so slow here. I don't think anyone would want to use this setting, regardless of the refresh rate band. Back to my preferred normal setting now, and I've also turned up the graphics settings further. A nice thing about G-Sync is that it gives you seamless operation throughout the variable refresh rate range. It doesn't have a defined window in the same way that adaptive sync models do, where they cross over a certain point. It's usually 48 Hz, 48 frames a second. Sometimes it can be a little bit lower than that, say 40 Hz, sometimes even slightly lower than that, but usually it's 48 Hz. G-Sync modules don't have that issue. They will just keep on going down in terms of their refresh rate. They won't cross over into this LFC window. And what LFC, low frame rate compensation, does is it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with the refresh rate of the monitor, and that does work well to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. But there's also momentary stuttering when it engages, so if you're frequently crossing that boundary, whatever it might be, it can be quite annoying. G-Sync modules don't have that issue. And the same thing applied when I accessed the G-Sync module with my AMD card, so I was using AMD FreeSync. It's technically really just using the G-Sync module, a different route of using the G-Sync module, using adaptive sync instead. So you don't have LFC then either. It's just seamless operation. There's not as distinct a boundary. Having said that, I'm just going to make my frame rate go super low. I'm going to have to use a frame rate limiter for this because it's very difficult to do this otherwise. So you'll see it's down to 20 now, and it's still displaying 20 there. That actually displays the refresh rate of the display, not specifically the frame rate of the content, although it does match in most cases, so that's fine. If I go down to 15, same thing. If I, however, go below 10, let's say to 8, you'll see that's gone to 16. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that, but there's a red 8, which is the frame rate towards the top right. It does appear that it uses a multiple when it's below 10 frames a second, but the operation still seems to be seamless, or as seamless as it can be at such low frame rates. You'll be able to see in the video even, it's even worse when you're interacting with it, but it's horrendously slow, and it doesn't really matter what the monitor's doing in terms of perhaps introducing a tiny amount of stuttering. You're not going to be able to perceive that stuttering in between this disgusting mess of a horrible frame rate anyway. I just thought I'd point out that technically it may be using frame to refresh multiplication, but only below 10 frames a second, where it really doesn't matter anyway. So I know there was quite a lot to take in there, but just to summarise, the monitor doesn't make perfect use of the 144 Hz refresh rate, but there's still plenty of benefit to be had from it. I also do enjoy the combination of high refresh rate and very high pixel density. I think it's very nice having some of those details much better defined during motion or during slight motion than they would be at 60 Hz. Definitely a big difference, and this monitor still delivers really nice connected feel and that kind of thing from the high refresh rate. Most of the pixel responses are pretty fast, but there are some weaknesses, particularly for very dark or very bright shades. It's probably not going to keep most competitive gamers all that happy. Casual gamers, it depends on your sensitivity. I know some people can be really sensitive to slight weaknesses and that kind of thing, and for them then perhaps it's not going to be ideal. For the kind of gaming that this is designed for, really immersive gaming, most people aren't going to find these weaknesses distracting, and even if they would find typical VA models distracting, this one hopefully won't be for them. To wrap up then, aesthetically the monitor has a definite style, ROG Swift styling, quite gamery, won't be to everyone's taste, and other people might quite like it actually. Personally, I like some of the design elements, others I'm not too fussed about. I do like how solid the overall feel is, especially with the powder coated metal stand. I always like a bit of metal on the stand. The lighting features I'm not really too bothered about. I mean, again, it's something that some people will quite like. And there's also the live dash feature. Some people will see this as a bit of a gimmick, others will find it quite useful. I would have been quite happy if they didn't bother with that feature personally. In terms of contrast performance, the monitor put in quite a good performance for the panel type actually, a bit stronger than some IPS models, but when you turn on the variable backlight feature, the local dimming, it really does take it to a different level compared to most monitors. 1152 dimming zones brought to life, doing their thing, worked very effectively. The light, it's a very light matte anti-glare screen surface. I found it quite agreeable in terms of how light it was, in terms of it not giving a layered appearance in front of the image. A touch of graininess, something I'm personally quite sensitive to, so I did notice it, but not everyone's going to notice that or be bothered by that. In terms of colour reproduction, good vibrant colour output if you're using the native gamut, strong vibrancy, excellent coverage of the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 colour spaces, and of course sRGB, so good flexibility there. The sRGB emulation setting, which cuts down the colour gamut so it follows sRGB more closely, worked very well, and the way it's implemented, it's actually enabled by default and it doesn't lock anything off, so you can customize the brightness, the color channels, gamma, whatever you need to with that setting active. That's really how sRGB emulation settings should be implemented. And the IPS type panel also helped in terms of the color consistency, quite a large screen, and if you have a VA model of this kind of size, and certainly a TN model of anywhere near this kind of size, then you're going to get clear shifts in saturation. But the IPS type panel on this one kept things nice and consistent, didn't lose saturation towards the edges in the same kind of way, so that was good as well. The HDR performance of the monitor, that's really one of its defining features. I was very impressed. I mean, it's impressive on paper, but to actually experience it firsthand is very different. And I don't think anything I can say on the video or show you in the video really does justice. It really is impressive with how deep some of the dark shades are, while simultaneously how impressively bright and eye-catching some of the brighter shades are. It also has a good colour gamut for HDR purposes. That works very well. On the colour side of things, there were some issues with haloing or blooming in places, and some content's going to show that more readily than others, but I did look at a lot of content, movie content, video content, games. To be honest, most of the time this was just a non-issue, and I really enjoyed the overall experience. And because of how powerful the backlight was and how bright the bright elements were, I found I could really enjoy it in a brighter room as well. And I didn't find it at all uncomfortable to use. Your mileage may vary in that respect, everyone's eyes are different. The responsiveness of the monitor, bit of a mixed bag really. It is nice that it has a 144Hz refresh rate. Quite a few of the pixel transitions were pretty fast and made good use of that, and you still do get benefits from that regardless of the fact that some of the pixel responses were quite a bit slower than optimal. But the overall experience in that respect, better than your typical high refresh rate VA model, but still not up there with the fastest IPS type performers. I would stress again that really this monitor is designed more for casual and immersive gaming rather than anything too competitive. And I also should mention the screen size and resolution worked very nicely. Really nice pixel density, great desktop real estate, excellent level of detail for suitably high resolution image content, and that includes games and 4K UHD movie content. So with all this said, obviously, as with many monitors, there are pros, there are cons, you have to weigh it all up. You also have to factor in that this is certainly an expensive monitor. It retails for somewhere in the region of $3,000 US at the time of review. So you really have to decide how much you like the sound of a really solid HDR experience and the other aspects such as vibrant colour output, a good local dimming solution for SDR as well. It is useful even under SDR, and really whether you're prepared to pay for that. Of course, it would have been nicer if the responsiveness was better and I could have said that, you know, it's sort of pretty much a perfect 144Hz experience. That wasn't the case, of course. At the moment on the market, there aren't really a huge range of alternatives that have this size of screen, this resolution, and also this refresh rate. It's really quite a new thing. The option that is available at the moment would be the Gigabyte Aorus FI32U, which is significantly cheaper. It retails at around $1,000, actually a little bit less sometimes. It has a much worse HDR performance. It doesn't have the same kind of full array local dimming backlight, which could be used under SDR or HDR. The colour gamut isn't as generous, so it's not as vibrant, extends a bit beyond sRGB, so it does inject some extra vibrancy. Some people might quite like that look actually. And from what I understand, the pixel responsiveness should be quite a bit stronger on that one. But I haven't tested it myself, so I can't really draw more of a technical comparison there. And there are also various models coming from ASUS, such as the PG32UQ without the X at the end. ASUS have a few as well, the XB323K, and the XB323UQX, if I'm not mistaken. I've got lots of these strange model codes swimming around in my head at the moment, so I could have got that wrong. And there's also the ViewSonic XG320U. None of these are available yet, so again, can't do technical comparisons or anything like that, but they're just much cheaper models. They don't have the same level of HDR support at all. It just depends what you're after, what your budget is, and really what's important to you in the experience. So that's really all there is to the ASUS PG32UQX. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.